Renewed hope for thousands of cancer patients in India as their government ends the monopoly of a giant firm producing an expensive drug. But what's the justification for overruling patents? And will this kind of decision convince drug producers to lower their prices? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finnegan. German pharmaceutical firm Bayer says that it will challenge an Indian court ruling on one of its anti-cancer drugs. A local drug maker has been allowed to produce a cheaper copy. And as Al Jazeera's Prerna Suri reports from New Delhi, this is giving hope to many cancer patients.
2 years ago, Al Jazeera visited Santosh Kumar's home in southern India. He was suffering from cancer of the intestines. 6 months later, he was dead. There are drugs that can treat this disease, but his family couldn't afford them. And there are millions of patients like Santosh who can never afford cancer drugs. But for many, that may be about to change. An Indian patent office has forced German pharmaceutical giant Bayer to give up on its monopoly on selling anti-cancer drugs. Instead, a local Indian company has been allowed to produce a vastly cheaper copy of it. Bayer says it will challenge the ruling.
From $5,000 per person per month, these drugs will now cost less than $200 a month. So prices have dropped by nearly 97%.
Something that's going to give these people renewed hope. They're all cancer patients who can't afford life-saving drugs and who depend upon subsidized basic treatment. Many like Munni Devi, who's suffering from ovarian cancer, come from rural villages. Her son has already sold the family land and they're barely surviving.
We've lost everything. All our money has gone in my treatment, so if medicines become cheaper, maybe it'll be better for us.
India used to be the pharmacy of the world, producing cheap versions of life-saving drugs. But in 2005, under pressure from the World Trade Organization, it signed a patent agreement which barred companies from producing affordable versions of patented drugs. The latest ruling overrides that ban under certain conditions. And activists say it has massive repercussions for drug companies and their patents globally.
If more generic companies come forward to apply for AIDS medicines, asthma, all the drugs that are getting patented over years, then you can hope sort of the drugs will be available in the future from India. That simply because a patent has been granted, it does not mean the generic production will shut down.
The cheaper drugs may have come too late for people like Santosh, but there's hope now that millions more can be saved. Prerna Suri, Al Jazeera, New Delhi.
Well, Al Jazeera has been in touch with Bayer, but it's declined our request for an interview. It sent us instead this statement. They said, "We're very disappointed with the order of the Patent Controller of India. We strongly disagree with his conclusions and will appeal the order to defend our intellectual property rights, which are a prerequisite for bringing innovative medicines to patients. We will continue to ensure the supply of innovative medicines to patients in India and offer healthcare providers in India our expertise in order to contribute to the national healthcare system." So, should public interest overrule the profits made by big pharmaceutical firms? To answer that, or to at least help us answer that, we're joined by our three guests today from Washington, D.C. James Love, Director of Knowledge Ecology International. He's also the U.S. co-chair of the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue and the Intellectual Property Policy Committee. Mr. Love has also been involved in the NAFTCO pharma case and submitted the affidavit on behalf of the pharmaceutical company. From London, we're joined by Kevin Craig, Managing Director of Political Lobbying and Media Relations. For over 10 years, he's been an advisor to drug companies in the US and Europe in their quest to bring new medicines to the market. And joining us on the line from Marbella, Yusuf Hamied, the Chairman and Managing Director of Cipla. Cipla's a prominent Indian pharmaceutical company, perhaps best known for manufacturing low-cost antiretroviral drugs to treat HIV and AIDS. Kevin Craig, if we can start with you first, why is Bayer so upset at this ruling? It is, after all, still going to receive 6% of all generic sales as a royalty.
I think Bayer, quite understandably in my opinion, are concerned that there is, in this debate, a lack of appreciation of the costs and the time it takes to bring drugs to market. It will have noted that no Indian firm has to date taken a drug from the laboratory to market, and it will be seeking in its next steps and its consideration of legal action how to get a fair proportion of revenue for its patented products. I think any pharmaceutical company with any morals and integrity, and I think Bayer is one, as are GSK and others, cannot fail to be moved by the stories of individuals in countries who can't get access to medicines. But there is a more complicated discussion to be had here than simply painting multinational pharmaceutical companies as greedy. It is more complex than that. It is about the cost, the real cost to bring a drug to market. It is about a discussion of how much that costs, how long it takes, how many companies fail. I've seen in 10 years at PLMR, working with the pharmaceutical and life sciences, how difficult it is to bring concepts from the laboratory into becoming medicines.
Is it a misconception then that the days of true innovation in the pharmaceutical industry are long gone, that today we know or have discovered all of the various chemical compounds that there are to discover, and today that the industry is mostly just tweaking and repackaging existing products? New discoveries are today actually pretty rare, and that research costs compared with 30 years ago are pretty low.
I fundamentally disagree with that. I think there was a very seminal article in Forbes earlier this year talking about the real cost of drug development, the advent of increased numbers of people suffering from chronic diseases, the fact that we still haven't tackled cancer, heart disease. I fundamentally, based on over 10 years close to the life sciences sector and the pharmaceutical sector, I fundamentally disagree with that. There's no evidence for that at all.
Kevin, thank you, Kevin, for the moment. James Love, all right, I grant you that developing and testing new drugs is an expensive process. It requires significant investment, but patents can also give rise to monopolies, can't they? Enormous power for big corporations. Surely it's only right that the drug manufacturers' control over access and price be tempered as it has in India this week.
Well, we really supported the decision by the controller of patents to override the patent in the Bayer case. They were charging $69,000 US dollars per year for a cancer drug in India that you have to take all your life. And even at current average incomes, you'd have to work 41 months to earn enough money to pay for 1 month's supply of the drugs in India. So it was really not really a close call in terms of the pricing thing. It's interesting that the previous speaker and Bayer have raised in the media the issue of the cost of drug development. That was actually an issue in the case. I provided evidence on behalf of NATCO on the R&D cost of this particular drug. It was developed in combination with a company called Onyx Pharmaceuticals in the United States. And Onyx Pharmaceuticals is a fairly small company, so they actually disclosed what they spent on the R&D in filings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. And the cost, the combined cost of Bayer and Onyx Pharmaceuticals through the registration of the drug was around $275 million. But the net cost was lower because the U.S. government had a tax credit to reimburse the company for about half the cost of the clinical trials that qualified as orphan drug trials. So that money was recovered almost immediately by Bayer after the product was registered. The product's generating now roughly $1 billion a year. So it's one thing to talk about the cost, it's another to talk about the revenues. It's not as if Bayer wants to be put on a cost-plus basis. What they want to do is they want to make an unlimited amount of revenue and then selectively raise the sort of idea that there's big cost involved whenever they want to avoid arguments about how reasonable the prices are.
Okay, I know Kevin Craig will want to come back on that, but first let's bring in Yusuf Hamied. You are viewed as a hero by many, as a pirate, according to one head of a global drugs manufacturer. What's your reaction to what you've heard so far?
What I've heard so far, again, it's a question of monopoly. But I'd like to tell Kevin that about 70% of the leading drugs in the world today are in-licensed products where people pay royalties. I mean, let's give you some examples. Tamiflu, that is marketed by Roche, was not invented by Roche. Lipitor of Pfizer was not invented by Pfizer. So people are paying or in-licensing products and paying royalties. That's exactly what the third world and developing countries like India want. That we are willing to pay royalties on patented products, and what we really require is a pragmatic, compulsory licensing system for the third world and developing world. Canada had this. Canada had, under the bill S91, a 4% royalty on any patented drug that they could manufacture in Canada. Nobody objected. This was a law in Canada from 1969 to 1992. And I say that if it was good enough for the Canadians and nobody objected for that long period of time, why is a similar situation not good enough for the third world and countries like India, where the disease pattern
Okay. All right, Mr.
is horrendous?
Yeah, Mr. Hamied, as we said at the beginning of the program, your company is now the biggest manufacturer of antiretrovirals in the world, the drugs used to treat HIV and AIDS. How has the ability to get around restrictive patents helped your firm in terms of innovation? What has it allowed you to do?
We are today producing antiretroviral drugs that were patented in India pre-1995, or where there was prior knowledge pre-1995. Subsequent to that, there are today third and fourth generation antiretroviral drugs that I cannot say copy. I'm willing to pay royalties, but I'm being restricted. So the question on antiretrovirals, the prices will go up because of this restriction on compulsory licensing.
I was wondering, in terms of innovation, though, whether you were able to take patented drugs and combine them so that they become more effective treatments.
That's what we did, and that's how you got the cocktail in one single tablet. In 2001 and 2002, and subsequently now the multinational companies are also patenting cocktails of products that do not 100% belong to them. They are taking other companies' products as well, combining it with their own products and patenting various cocktails. This has now become common practice among patenting. So
Kevin Craig, I know you want to respond to what you've heard. Does the public not have a right to be able to access innovative drugs and not be blocked from benefiting from new products by excessive prices? Surely health and in many cases life is far more important than profit and intellectual property.
Well, first of all, to me and millions of others actually, Yusuf is not a pirate. He is somewhat of a living legend for the achievements that he has contributed in his life. What both he and the previous speaker are not addressing in their points, which do have some merits. And I think that pragmatism is important. I'm sure the WTO is going to revisit this. But we have to think about who then is going to pay for the researching the next generation of drugs and who pays for failure. You can't, as the previous speaker did, talk about really, to be totally fair, the development costs of the drug in question. Somebody has to pay for the drugs and medicines medicines that don't make it to licensing and which are not successful. And over recent years, you look at some major new medicines that have come into being. Pfizer had one on HIV that cost tens and tens of millions of pounds, involving thousands of people, and it has to be paid for. I think there's definitely room. There are some, I would say, excessive profit margins as part of this debate, but you've got to talk about the cost and the time to develop new medicines. There's something in the pharmaceutical and life sciences sector that we call a patient cliff, and in the coming years, the patient cliff, which is the cost and the revenues involved when drugs come off patent, which will then be open to be replicated by generic companies, these are billions and billions of pounds. And also, India, with all due respect, yes, there are huge issues now of poverty and access to healthcare, but India has a middle class of over 100 million people. You know, India is in many ways, it is an equal country in terms of the middle class and the purchasing power of the middle class to first world countries. Okay. So I think this debate is very complicated. I think people like Yusuf are legends for what they've achieved, but I just think it's too simple. Some of the reporting around Bayer's actions is oversimplistic. And I think that's the issue. I want to see where people think the costs of future medicines and the research, okay. Who's going to do it?
Okay. James Love, who's going to pay? Would a system perhaps like the one once proposed by economist and Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz, where a prize fund is established to spur innovation with large prizes for big innovations and cures, and smaller ones for tweaks to existing drugs and treatments? Would that be a better model of funding innovation in the pharmaceutical industry, do you think?
It would. First, I just want to respond to this issue on the Bayer data. The Bayer research program that I referred to, the $275 million, which was then subsidized through the orphan drug tax credit subsidies in the United States, included research on other compounds that were failures. It also included money that was spent on clinical trials for other indications which failed. It also included what they call seeding trials on the thing. So it was a lot more than the direct cost of the drug, just to clear that up. But what your reference to Professor Stiglitz's article about the prize system, there's a proposal right now before the World Health Organization on cancer drugs to move toward a cancer prize fund model where developing country governments commit to some fraction of their national expenditures on cancer treatment to pay off innovators for new products, but in return that they get access to low-cost generic products, that you just eliminate the monopolies on cancer drugs, and you just negotiate what fraction of the cancer budget goes to pay off the R&D thing. You essentially delink the R&D incentives from the prices of the drugs. I just don't think it's realistic to say that the world can back a system which denies 80% of the world's population access to life-saving drugs as a principal way of funding R&D. With the previous speaker, he mentioned the 100 million people in India that they consider middle class. That is essentially the market that drug companies are trying to reach in India. But that means they're leaving out 1.1 billion people that are not in that definition. So you just can't have a system where you treat 100 million and you ignore 1.1 billion people for cancer drugs. It isn't really acceptable anymore. So I think that things like the Cancer Prize Fund, that Professor Stiglitz and a lot of other experts and we have looked at, and is quite important. I will add that the United States Senate is going to have a hearing on the 15th of May on the idea of breaking the monopolies on AIDS drugs in the United States and replacing it with a system of prizes.
Okay. Yusuf Hamied, I was reading somewhere that since 1997, the price index for drugs has grown much faster than the index for all commodities in India, and that's evidence, it's argued, of unethical pricing purely for profit. To what extent should governments, individual governments, do you think, have more of a say in the pricing of drugs in a particular market?
We have said in India, at least the stand that we have taken, or Stipla has taken, or I have taken, is that drugs that are sold under monopoly should be under price control by the government. That is, the government should control the prices of monopoly drugs. Or drugs that are manufactured by more than 5 companies, those should be free. Competition leads to lower prices. And we strongly believe that access to vital life-saving drugs at affordable prices is the order of the day. Now, let me give you an example of the world's top-selling anti-AIDS drug, which is by Gilead, ATRIPLA. In America, you have to pay $24,000 per patient per year for ATRIPLA. Now, our drug and 1 or 2 other Indian companies' drugs that are US FDA approved under the PEPFAR scheme are being given to donor institutions like the Global Fund and the Clinton Foundation at below $200 per patient per year. Now, when can you compare $200 to the Africans and $24,000 to the Americans? I mean, there is something wrong somewhere which I don't fully understand. The power of monopoly can lead to obscene pricing by some of the multinational companies, like it was in the AIDS in the year 2000, when only 2,000 Africans could afford treatment.
Okay.
And that's when Cipla came in through Jamie Love. We gave the drugs at $300 per patient per year.
Okay.
And that changed the whole face of HIV, that today you have over 7 million Africans being treated for HIV.
Okay, we'll get a response from Kevin. We'll get a response to that from Kevin Craig in just a moment. Very briefly, though, Mr. Hamied, I just want to ask you if you can give me a brief answer. Are generic drugs of lower quality than those produced by the big multinationals?
We have to do bioequivalence testing. We have to test the drugs exactly like it is being done by WHO and US FDA. There are more factories in India that are US FDA approved. And India today is the pharmacy capital of the world. Our drugs are being used not only by the generic industry, but by the big pharma companies themselves, getting the raw materials, etc., from India.
Kevin,
so you can't say, people mention quality. Let Bayer, for example, test the drug of Natco and say that it is not equivalent to theirs.
Kevin Craig, the Indian Patent Office said that not only had Bayer failed to price the drug at a level that made it accessible and affordable, but that it had also failed to ensure the drug was available in sufficient and sustainable quantities in India. Now, the generic drug's going to sell for 97% less. Was Bayer, do you think, exploiting its position as the sole supplier of that particular drug? Could it be accused of price manipulation?
Well, I think we just need to be careful, because Bayer is considering its position in law, and it's very easy, I think, to make sweeping statements about multinationals as if they were organisations that didn't think and consider their corporate social responsibility. And I think their next step now will be very revealing in terms of what they would say in response to that accusation. I don't think I think that's open to being contested, what the Patent Office in India have said. And I think Bayer, like the GSKs of this world, like the Pfizers, they have, as global citizens, to listen to the sorts of arguments that are being put in this debate today. And of course there's a moral problem about the fact that 80% of the Indian population don't have access to some of these life-changing medicines. People in Europe don't have access to the medicines that they want. It's not a problem specific, it's the scale that's the issue. But I think Bayer's next step, I don't think they think that the ruling from the Patent Office takes into account the failure rate that they incur overall as a business finding and discovering new drugs. and I think they will also have one eye on the broader moral position that they occupy in the world, of course. And I don't think anyone with a brain who has been involved in life sciences or pharmaceuticals would say that there is no need for any discussion around profit margins on medicines. Of course there is, but let's inject balance into the discussion. Let's think about the sorts of initiatives that GSK have undertaken in Africa, where they've redirected huge percentages of their profit to the continent. I don't think there's a disagreement amongst all the speakers today that there is a problem of access to medicines, but let's actually be reasonable to a company like Bayer, and let's accept that they haven't yet publicly been specific about the legal action they're going to take. And please, I did hear the gentleman a few moments ago about the drug in question, about the costs, but I'm sorry, people have to understand that billions of dollars are spent on drugs that never see the light of day, that ultimately lead to better medicines.
Thank you to all my guests today from Washington, D.C., James Love, in London, Kevin Craig, and in Marbella, Yusuf Hamied. And thank you very much indeed for being with us on this edition of Inside Story. As always, if you want to send us your feedback, email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Bye for now.